Hi there, Dr. Alan Christensen here. Are your veggies poisoned? What do I mean by this? Well, there's been a big trend in a lot of popular literature. A lot of blog posts, a lot of experts have talked about all these hidden things in your food that seem really dangerous. The big ones you hear about are oxalates, nightshade compounds, phytic acid, also goitrogens. And honestly, if you follow all these lists and pay attention to all these items, you would come away with it with no foods left to eat. So let's talk about this. These compounds in general, they're all a class called phytotoxins. Sounds pretty scary, right? Well, plants have chemical defenses. They have things that cause other plants not to grow right next to them, or also to fight off fungi or to fight off insects. There are things that protect them. Here in the Sonoran Desert, a lot of our plants have physical defenses. They've got sharp things. Many plants, their big protections are chemical. So what are some of these big chemical defenses? What foods are they in? And what is the real important steps you should be taking in your diet? Well, let's talk about these things group by group. One group you're hearing a lot about is the oxalates. Now, oxalates are found in a pretty big variety of foods, and the argument is that when you consume oxalates, your body generates more oxalic acid. And it's been known for some time that some people do make too much oxalic acid. About 1 to 3 people per million have a condition called hyperoxaluria. And that means that they generate a lot of oxalic acid, they make too much in their urine, and that causes a rare type of kidney stone to form. So we've known that for a while. The foods that are known to raise urinary oxalates include blackberries, beets, spinach, rhubarb, strawberries, a few different types of nuts, chocolate, tea, wheat bran, and then also many types of dry beans and legumes, with the exception of lima beans, so they don't have that. And there's been debate back and forth as to whether these foods, which do raise urinary oxalate, whether or not they worsen kidney stones in the 1 to 3 out of a million who have the genetic condition. The data is pretty strong that even though tea might raise oxalates in the urine, it actually decreases kidney stones even in that population. So that's the part that's known or pretty solid. So past that, there's been theories that oxalates get into the body and they cross into the brain and they hurt the joints and they cause all these variety of symptoms. Now, there's never been solid data really correlating that, and there's not even a strong mechanism, there's not even a plausible way how that would happen. The oxalates that we have, oxalic acid in our bloodstream, the vast majority of it, our body makes naturally. It's not coming from our diet, it's stuff that we produce. But many conditions like arthritis or chronic pain conditions or mood changes, the very nature of the symptoms is that they ebb and flow. There's better days and worse days. And it can happen that if you happen to have had a high oxalate food on a day where you're symptomatic, you might suspect, wow, the food caused that. And now there's any number of apps and lists that show here's high oxalate foods. The problem is that they're not really in agreement. If you look through any number of those, the amount of oxalate they ascribe to certain foods and which foods they list are not consistent. And there have actually been academic studies done on this in which they've looked at many lists of oxalates, like this food has this many milligrams. And the consensus among researchers is that all these different lists and apps have no real correlation to one another. So the oxalate thing, if you're in the rare subset of people with hyperoxaluria, the genetic condition, usually you get kidney stones early in life, even before adolescence, and it often does get diagnosed because it's a very uncommon type of kidney stone when they analyze it. So those people, there's still a general idea you're better off avoiding those few high oxalate forming foods, with the exception of tea. For the rest of us, those are all pretty healthy foods, right? Beets and blackberries, they've got a lot of good things going for them. So I wouldn't stress too much about that one. Another big category that's gotten attention lately has been nightshade foods. These are also called solanaceae type plants. And that's the genus, that's the family, like the last name, Christensen, Allen. So the Christensen family, that group of plants, they're all called Solanaceae. And they include potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, bell pepper, also goji berries, a few other odds and ends. Garlic can be in that list. And it's been known for some time that portions of the plant have an alkaloid called solanine. And solanine is toxic, no debate about that. Potato leaves, for example, if you were to make a big giant salad from potato plant leaves, not a good idea. It could be fatal. The other concern is that when these plants are unripe or overripe, they can have more solanine. So also potatoes, if you were to take a lot of sprouting, very overripe potatoes with lots of green around the sprouting stuff and eat the green and the sprouts, you could get poisoned from that. The last case of solanine poisoning was about 1950 in the United States. So it's not a common problem. I grew up in northern Minnesota, and the house had a thing called a root cellar. You had an area in the basement where you would keep the root vegetables. And that would be your potatoes, your carrots, your rutabagas, all these peasant type root foods, squash and parsnips. And they would keep for quite a bit of the wintertime. The problem was that if the cellar was warm, if it was too close to areas you had heated, these things could start to sprout. They could start to go bad. And in the past, there were isolated cases of people eating too many green potatoes when they had fewer food options and getting poisoned. Now, there was also a time before tomatoes were brought to the New World to where they were thought to be poisonous. And it was true that the leaves of the tomato plant, like the potato plant, are things you don't want to eat. But we know that tomatoes are not poisonous foods. People don't die from tomatoes, even though that was thought in the past. In the early 80s, there was a researcher who theorized that tiny amounts of solanine was the culprit behind arthritis. And he argued that these foods could aggravate arthritic symptoms. And there were some pretty large studies done on the theory. It seemed like a plausible thing. We know that in cases of actual solanine toxicity, people can get joint pain as part of the symptoms. So it was argued that some have a lower threshold of sensitivity than others. Now, we're not sure if that's possible or not. There is a chance that some could be more sensitive, more allergic to solanine. It's plausible, not been documented just yet, but in the studies that were done after the proposed correlation with arthritis, they had people on diets that they didn't know what they were eating, but some diets had potatoes, some did not, and the foods were kind of hidden. And they had people monitor their symptoms and see when they had more joint pain, when they did not. The researchers didn't really know who was eating which diet, but after it was said and done, they got to see who had the higher solanine diets and who did not. And when it was looked at in that regard, there was really no correlation between eating nightshade plants and joint pain. So again, there may be a small number of people out there who have an unusual sensitivity to solanine. We haven't really seen any evidence of that just yet, possible, but as far as general arthritis, general joint pain, there's not a strong correlation between eating nightshade plants, if you're not aware of it, and getting some of those symptoms. So again, a lot of those plants, they're good foods. We have a lot of data about lycopene from tomatoes being a really good thing for the health of your eyes, offsetting macular degeneration, maintaining good prostate health, prostate function. Eggplant, also a great food, real rich in some fibers, also some good, unique B vitamins. So overall, good things. Another big category I want to talk about is phytic acid or phytates. Now, this fear came up a lot with the paleo movement. So the argument goes that some foods contain phytic acid. I've heard some nutrition experts say phytic acid. Not common, but I have heard that. But phytate, I think I've heard most commonly. So some foods contain phytic acid, and phytic acid is categorized as a phytotoxin, and it's also categorized as an anti-nutrient. And so an anti-nutrient is something that can bind up with nutrients and make them less absorbable. So the idea is that certain foods, especially beans, legumes, and grains, they've kind of gotten the bad rap out of this one. These foods are said to be higher in phytic acid, and the argument goes that if you eat them, the phytic acid will take away nutrients from your body, and it will also damage your intestinal tract. And it's been argued that could lead to autoimmune disease and other problems. Let's take a look at this one. So the phytic acid, the first thing is which foods have it, which foods don't. Well, a lot of foods that we call paleo foods have a ton of phytic acid. So green vegetables have it also. Coconut has phytic acid. Coffee has pretty fair amounts of it. Nuts and seeds have good amounts. And even meat, even animal protein, can have it based upon the diet of the animal that you're eating. So you can't so much get away from it. Some foods are a bit higher than others. Beans and grains are higher than some, but they're not the tops of the list. Per calorie, greens and also nuts and seeds tend to be quite a bit higher in phytic acid than grains and beans do. So let's look at this anti-nutrient thing. I almost imagine like this being a ninja breaking into your body and grabbing all of your zinc and manganese and then running out with it before it gets caught. And not so much. So what happens is that a food has a certain amount of nutrients. Like say your beans have 100 milligrams of magnesium, just making that up. If they did not have the phytic acid, it's possible that you would absorb maybe 120 milligrams of magnesium, but the phytic acid inhibits some of the absorption of it. Now, that doesn't say that it takes out what you have in your body, but it causes you to absorb less from that food. And that's known. We expect that. It also doesn't mean that if you had another food with minerals, that it would cause you not to absorb them from that food at the same meal. There was a big study done on this mechanism. One of the common problems we'll see with nutrient absorption is zinc. Zinc can be really hard to get in the body. And some populations are really at risk for low zinc. One of the biggest ones is adolescent boys. They need more of it, and their diets may not contain much of it. There was one big study done on adolescent boys on diets that were clearly high, unusually high in phytic acid. And it was shown they did not develop zinc deficiencies from that. So not a big factor. Theoretically it could be. There have been some cases of people at risk for anemias who have been a little more anemic when their diets are higher in phytic acid. But honestly, a well-rounded diet can really circumvent that. Now, one more thing about phytic acid. There's actually a lot of research. If you were to go onto medical databases and research it, see what's been studied, there's tons of data about it being cancer protective. So big cancer types too. So breast, prostate, colorectal cancers, lung cancers, they're all lower in those who have more phytic acid intake. So more of it's a good thing. And there's a version of phytic acid called IP6, or inositol hexaphosphatase. And it's such a powerful cancer fighter that it's the subject of a lot of phase 2 clinical trials. They're testing it as a cancer remedy. That's how good of a thing it is. So that's phytic acid. Not only would I not encourage you to be afraid of that one, I would encourage you to have that in your diets. Its effects as far as hurting the intestinal tract or causing autoimmunity, there's not really data supporting that. There was one argument in which someone hypothesized this could happen, but no studies showing that it's happened. And a lot of studies showing that it's actually a very good thing for the immune system, such as the lower risk of cancers. Now, the other last class of compounds that you've been told to be afraid of is goitrogens. And this would include especially cruciferous vegetables. So broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, spinach, they come up quite a bit in this list. Soy gets put in there, also millet. And this one, if you're in an area in which iodine is malabsorbed and that causes goiters or thyroid enlargements, a high goitrogenic diet will make that just a little bit worse. So let's say we could wind back the clock and we could go to Upper Michigan in the 1910s. At that time, about a third of kids in school had goiters. They had enlarged necks. Now, if the kids had a diet high in raw cruciferous vegetables, that might have gone from 30% to 35%. So there was a small increase. What's the relevance of goitrogens to your health in the modern world now that we have iodine fortified? It's none as far as a bad thing. Now, the same compounds, these same indole compounds that are goitrogenic, they're also cancer fighters. There's a lot of data that, especially the hormonal cancers, so here we think about breast, ovarian, prostate, those are all at lower risk when you've got a higher intake of broccoli, cruciferous vegetables. They're very good things. The one goitrogenic food I would question would be soy. We've got concerns back and forth about hormonal effects, concerns about its effect on autoimmune thyroid disease. So I'm not a fan of soy. There are unfermented versions of soy, like texturized vegetable protein or soy protein isolates or tofu. Those are the most questionable. The fermented versions of soy, such as miso or tempeh or natto, I had some of this just a few days ago. I had my daughter try it. Natto is pretty intense stuff. It's a fermented paste with some chunks of soy, and it's ridiculously healthy. It's very high in vitamin K2, which is a powerful thing for keeping your body from calcifying. It's also very good for the immune system and the intestinal tract, but it's quite an acquired taste. So fermented soy, pretty clearly not dangerous. Unfermented soy, questionable, worth watching. Other goitrogens, they're actually really good foods. They're very healthy for you. So how has this come about that we've been told to fear so many different foods, and what's the relevance of this to our health? I think that there's a lot of things we're justified in avoiding. I don't know if fear is the best response, but certainly avoiding and limiting in our diets. And I'd put all the weird processed foods on that list, and I'd put sugar on the top of that list. So we've got enough to worry about there. Let's not add unnecessary fear to foods that are naturally occurring. If we could rewind 100 years and look at the foods that our grandparents had access to, they're not dangerous foods. No one has wrecked their health because they didn't know to avoid blackberries or beets or broccoli. Quite the opposite. These are wonder foods. And the exact same compounds that are plant defenses are things that help our bodies. Now, plant defenses are specific, so you really want a variety, and you wouldn't want just one type of food forever. Let's say you really were concerned still and you wanted to avoid all these phytotoxins. How would you go about doing that? Well, you can't eat plants, you can't eat legumes, you can't eat grains, you can't eat nuts and seeds, because honestly, everything in that category has that. Now, here's the other wrinkle. Animals have the stuff too, because guess what? Our animals eat plants, and they end up with numbers of these phytotoxins in their bodies and in their meat. So what you're left with would be purely synthetic, processed, isolated foods. So Twinkies are pretty low in phytotoxins. I would not advise those. So the only way to be off phytotoxins is to be off of natural foods, and that's a bad thing. So much data shows that a variety of unprocessed foods serves us well. So closing point, I want to put a teaser for a future topic. How could it be that someone could eat a food which probably is medically safe, but they could get symptoms afterwards that definitely came on after they did so? There's a thing called the nocebo effect, and it's very real, it's very powerful. And we'll talk more about this in future topics, and I'll teach you all how you can avoid that and have greater tolerance of more good foods. Thanks so much for tuning in. Dr. Christensen signing out. Back with you real soon.